It's been over 3 years since the release of Elden Ring, and after all this time, it's still amazing to look back at the game and dig through the finer details of even the most well-known characters. The stories of Radahn, Melania, Mikola, and Ranni are still as mysterious as they have ever been, because even though we've learned so much more over time, not every question has a straight answer. Even so, we continue to explore and try to reach a better understanding of this world and its players. However, I want us to take a closer look at someone you've likely forgotten about. This royal golden heir is now nothing more than an entertaining diversion when we make our way through another new run of Elden Ring. A boss no one would ever consider a stumbling point anymore. Today I'm taking a closer look at Godrick the Grafted, the coward, the pitiable, the lord of all that is golden who barely held his own castle. Godrick was likely once nothing more than a boy who knew he could never live up to his lineage, and that constant feeling of inadequacy created a man with an unquenchable thirst to make himself more powerful, by any means necessary. Welcome back to Square Table Gaming, where we bring you the lore of Elden Ring and Night Rain every week. This week we are sponsoring ourselves again by asking you to check out our Patreon. With the way YouTube is these days, it's becoming harder to sustain the channel. So if you've enjoyed our lore dives, or just used us to fall asleep, please consider joining. Much like our memberships on YouTube, we're offering early access to our content, but at additional tiers, you've got new perks, like behind-the-scenes looks at our editing process, access to the scripts for all of our videos, and ad-free content. If you want to support the channel and enjoy our entire library ad-free, please consider signing up for the STG Patreon. With that said, let's get back to the lowliest demigod. Godrick was not always known as the Grafted. He once carried the same title as the favorite child of the Golden Order, Godwyn the Golden. When facing him, he calls himself the Golden, and it would be easy to assume that it's a name he had given himself. But Morgott also refers to him as Godrick the Golden. This means that the Grafted moniker he's taken on is likely one he does not particularly want or like. I think it's fair to assume his title of the Grafted is an insult that's been foisted upon him by those who saw him debase his holy flesh, due to his desperate need to be seen as equal in power and status to the rest of his demigod family. Indeed, this would have been seen as shameful for a descendant of the Golden Son of Marika and Godfrey. However, it's not as if he had much choice in the matter. When speaking with Kenneth Haidt, he refers to Godrick as a jumped-up country bumpkin, and expresses disbelief that he is part of the family line that stretches directly back to Godfrey himself. I believe that if the great Kenneth Haidt saw Godrick this way, it's likely the other common people of the Lands Between did as well, and if that's the case, there must have been a reason. As far as we know, Godwyn had no consort. He likely had Ranni promised to him, as they would have been the perfect couple to take over for Marika and Radagon. However, the Knight of Black Knives ensured this would never come to pass. This means that in order for Godrick to be of the same stock as Godwyn, he must have had other consorts in the Lands Between who were considered common women. If this were the case, Godwyn must have had at least one child to carry on his bloodline, but I don't think that child was Godrick. Inside Neverjail, we can find and do battle with a man known as Godefroy the Grafted. You'd be forgiven for thinking this is simply a cut and paste of the Godrick fight, so we can pad out the jails. However, this character actually has lore significance. The ancient dragon knight Kristoff's ashes tell us, after the first defense of Leyndell, Kristoff earned the hero's honor of Erdtree burial for the feat of capturing Godefroy the Grafted. This means that Godefroy not only marched on Leyndell during the Shattering, but he's likely the father of Godrick. If Godefroy is Godrick's father, that would separate him even more from the Golden lineage, as he's at least a whole generation removed from their bloodline. With that said, the proof of his heritage is apparent, not only in his obsession with gold and Godfrey, but in his very flesh itself. It's impossible to say whether or not Godefroy was the first to discover the art of grafting, but it was certainly made a part of his family. Godrick likely grew up around the art of grafting, a symbolic act that, while considered shameful, is actually an interesting interpretation of the Golden Lineage's connection to the Erd Tree. Tree grafting is the process of joining a part of one tree, the scion, to the root system of another, the rootstock, so that they may grow as a single plant. This horticultural technique is used for purposes like changing a tree's variety, saving time, or repairing damaged plants. It involves making precise cuts to join the two plants, and securing the union with tape or wax until they fuse together. So just as the Golden Lineage is inextricably connected to the Erd Tree, those that practice grafting make of themselves a rootstock. They are the trees that gain strength through the art of melding their flesh with those that carry some level of power. Interestingly, the proof of his lineage is that Godrick and his grafted scions don't need any kind of tape or wax to graft. Their flesh can be traced all the way back to the shamans, who were capable of harmoniously melding with others. While his family likely never knew it, they were practicing the arts of the horn scent that arguably may have created their bloodline in the first place with Marika. Given how Marika felt about the horn scent, this is another reason the Golden Lineage may have looked down on Godrick. With this in mind, it's fair to say that regardless of how weak he is, how diluted his demigod blood may be, he is the true heir to Godwyn the Golden. But it's likely he was raised in Stormveil Castle, where his family worshipped their connection to Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. He was steeped in the imagery of this lord, and believes he'll someday be delivered to a land of honeyed rays of gold. However, this focus on his lineage left Godrick obsessed with strength and status. Since we know Godefroy practiced the art of grafting, it's likely Godrick started at a young age as well. We know that he sent his forces out into the lands between on tarnished hunts, as the Tarnished were known as the people of Godfrey's tribe, capable of wielding great strength. For this reason, the Tarnished would be rounded up and brought to Godrick, so that he might pick and choose the strongest pieces amongst them, to graft to his own body, and those of his scions, chasing the strength of his bloodline so that the other demigods would take him seriously. One thing I'm having trouble reconciling is when exactly Godrick started grafting himself. It is said that the Tarnished hunts were meant to make him stronger. However, it's implied he also took Gostok's arm for grafting. So presumably, Godrick started grafting before the Tarnished came back to the lands between, trying to make himself more powerful. I think we can assume that Godrick started grafting himself after the Shattering. We know that Godefroy grafted before him, and it was likely something that was always expected of Godrick. But it wouldn't be until the demigods started marching against each other that he would truly need this strength. During the first siege of Leyndell, Godefroy was captured and Godrick escaped with his life, thanks to the Mimic Veil. When Godrick was hounded from Leyndell, the royal capital, this was one of the multitude of treasures he took with him, also known as Marika's Mischief. Thanks to Kenneth Haight, we know that he used the veil to hide amongst the womenfolk fleeing the capital, and as we know from using the veil, it doesn't alter your size substantially, so we can assume Godrick was not yet as large as he is when our Tarnished faces him. I believe it was after he fled the capital during the siege that he started grafting in earnest. From here, he made strides to become as powerful as possible, but when Radahn came to his castle, he hid rather than facing his towering uncle. Perhaps it was fear, as well as arrogance and envy, that pushed Godrick down this path, as he could clearly see how much stronger his family was with their less diluted demigod blood. After cowering behind Stormveil's walls at the presence of Radahn, Godrick would go on to graft himself over and over again, believing he was gaining some kind of true power, enough to challenge his family. This newfound confidence saw him insult Malenia, who promptly showed him just how weak he was compared to the rest of the demigods, and rather than accept his death, he groveled with her for his life. I can't say why Malenia spared him, but perhaps it has something to do with Miquella's affection for Godwyn the Golden. It's implied he had a good relationship with his stepbrother, so perhaps he didn't want his hand to cut down what little was left of the brother he lost so long ago. From here, we know little else about Godrick. He ordered Edgar the Revenger to take back Castle Morn from the Misbegotten, and procure the grafted great blade so that it was not sullied by the hands of these subhuman creatures. This weapon is known as the Storied Sword of Castle Morn, a Revenger's weapon. It is burdened with oceans of anger and regret, one of the legendary armaments. A lone surviving champion from a country now vanished was so determined to continue fighting that he claimed the swords of an entire clan of warriors. You could argue that the man who claimed the swords of these warriors was Godfrey, making this blade another attempt by Godrick to recreate himself in the image of his ancestor. He also started having his main forces leave the castle in order to hunt Tarnished, so that he might graft their parts on himself and his scions. But he also filled his castle with other warriors to defend him. I assume that Godrick did not trust his forces that were closely tied to the Golden Order, because we see none of them within the walls of Stormveil. Instead, we fight exiled soldiers, as well as banished knights, an omen, a troll, a grafted scion, and even a crucible knight. These forces were built to defend the castle from within, while his original army was essentially living in exile, with their only purpose being to bring him more Tarnished, to make their lord stronger. I believe this is why we find the Soldier of God, Rick, in the tutorial area. At the bottom of a cavern, Tarnished were likely thrown into quite often upon reaching the Lands Between. It makes sense. When your own forces were granted to you by Leyndell, and the demigods sitting at the head of the capital have deemed you worthless, how could you possibly trust these soldiers not to revolt against you? Godrick proved himself to be a coward time and again, so how could he trust his soldiers would not think the worst of him, and act on those thoughts? Here is where we make our way to the Lands Between, encountering Roderica, who warns us about the spider, and Margit, who tests our mettle before we reach Stormveil Castle. We find our way through to the end, where we encounter Nefeli Loux, who confirms all we've heard about Godrick up to this point.
How utterly repellent this is. This grafting of Godrick's ill befits a lord. He's tainted the very winds. If you intend to challenge Godrick, I ask you call upon me. The winds run foul with his deeds. I'm certain Father would permit me aid the fight.
With or without Nefeli's help, we press forward and face Godrick the Grafted.
Mighty dragon, thou'rt a true-born heir. Lend me thy strength, O kindred. Deliver me unto greater heights. Well. Lowly tarnished. Plain as a lord. I command thee kneel! I am the lord of all that is golden.
He fights wildly with an axe reminiscent of his ancestor Godfrey, but the axe is covered in gold. He's attempting to evoke the strength of both Godfrey and Godwyn in battle, but his monstrous form shows just how far he's divested himself from his golden roots. In fact, once the Tarnish cuts Godrick down enough, he mutilates himself even further.
Truest of dragons. Lend me thy strength.
With the strength of a dragon, the creatures Godwyn once made peace with, grafted to his very arm, Godrick believes there is no one capable of stopping him. However, he's yet to meet the Tarnished guided by both Grace and Melina. Godrick is finally brought to his knees, killed by one of the very people he's had grafted to his body over and over again. And after leaving the area and returning, we see what's left of him. The grafted parts of his body have melted away, leaving only his head and a small amount of torso, which is being crushed beneath the heel of the gatekeeper Gostock. Godrick has paid for his crimes against the Tarnished and his people, and his throne is now vacant, ready for another descendant of Godfrey to take his place and rule with fairness rather than madness. This is the story of Godrick the Grafted, a man who was likely raised to believe his only chance of gaining respect from his family was to prove his strength. He sat on a throne won by his ancestors, but allowed the shadow of their power to wash over him, filling him with feelings of inadequacy that would manifest as a lust for strength, using the only means he had available to him, his malleable shaman flesh. As he grew in strength, so too did his bravado, and time and again, he was put back in his place by his demigod family. Godrick the Golden is a pitiable creature who committed horrific acts in an attempt to prove his worth. And being put to the blade by our Tarnished is probably the best death he could have asked for. At the very least, his life was ended by the person who would take the throne, the future Elden Lord. Thank you for sticking with me as I took a look at one of the best-known enemies in Elden Ring. Do you believe Godrick the Grafted is the grandson of Godwyn the Golden? Or were there more generations between them? Was the practice of grafting something Godrick indulged in all of his life? Or was it a means to an end when it came to striving for power? Why did he risk speaking poorly of Melania, a demigod known to be one of the most dangerous living beings in the lands between? Let us know your thoughts and theories in the comments. Watch that button light up as I say like this video, and if you think we've earned it, please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss out on any of our lore dives. We look forward to seeing you again for more Elden lore.